September the 1st, 1939. German troops thrust deep into Poland to win a swift and absolute victory. Barely 20 years earlier, their forefathers had also been on the march, but back into their homeland as a defeated army. In November 1918, after 4 years of World War I, Germany's Emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II, had been forced to abdicate. His armies were being ground down by a remorseless offensive by British, French and US troops. His people faced starvation. But already, a dangerous myth was taking root. The German generals and troops claimed that they hadn't been defeated in battle, but betrayed by their own cowardly politicians. Even so, at 11 in the morning on November the 11th, 1918, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, World War I came to an end. The following month, President Woodrow Wilson of the United States arrived in Europe, promising to create a new world order. He persuaded the world's leaders to sign up to a new League of Nations. At the Treaty of Versailles, they agreed that from now on, disputes between countries would be resolved not by fighting, but by debate in the League. The peoples of Europe were set free. Germany's ally, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was dismembered. Out of it, new nations were created: Austria, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Germany itself was greatly reduced in size. But this process contained a time bomb. Not everyone celebrated the birth of countries like Czechoslovakia. Several of them contained substantial German minorities. One day, the desire to reunite the German peoples would come to haunt Europe. The war-torn German people also had one final indignity inflicted on them. They were forced to pay a massive £6.6 billion in reparations to France and Britain, something they could ill afford. And when he returned to America, Wilson's new world order immediately fell apart. The US Congress decided it could not risk being sucked into another war in Europe. It refused to join his league, and the US withdrew into isolationism. Germany was now a very different nation. It was still Europe's biggest country, but its militaristic monarchy had gone. It had become a democracy. But its government, the so-called Weimar Republic, was soon struck by a series of hammer blows. Street battles erupted between extreme right-wing nationalists and communists trying to start a revolution. Then, in 1923, the country was devastated by hyperinflation, which reached hundreds of % a month. Ordinary people's savings were wiped out. This was fertile ground for a new breed of rabble-rousing right-wing politicians. Among them, Adolf Hitler. Hitler had been born in Austria. He had fought bravely as a soldier in World War I and been awarded the Iron Cross. On returning to Germany, he settled in Munich, and his fiery oratory soon enabled him to seize control of the small National Socialist or Nazi Party. In October 1923, Hitler and his henchmen attempted an armed coup against the Weimar government. It failed, and he was sentenced to 9 months. In prison, he wrote a book, Mein Kampf, My Struggle, in which he blamed Germany's ills on the Jews and demanded that it rebuild its strength and seek new territories in the East. On his release, he set about building the Nazis into a proper, disciplined political party. From now on, he would use the democratic system to achieve power. But for the next 5 years, Weimar Germany prospered. Support for extremist parties, left and right, dwindled. Then suddenly, Hitler's opportunity arrived. In October 1929, the US stock market crashed. Billions of dollars were lost, and an economic depression swept across the world. Unemployment in Germany soared to over 6 million. Only extremist politicians seemed to offer a solution.
Wir haben ein Ziel uns gewählt und verfechten es fanatisch und rücksichtslos.
Politicians like Hitler. By 1931, his Nazis were a true mass movement. And they had their own brown-shirted thugs, the SA stormtroops, who numbered almost 3 million. In the 1932 elections, the Nazis became the largest party in Germany's parliament, the Reichstag. But Hitler refused to join a coalition, leaving parliament paralyzed. To break the impasse, President Hindenburg made him Chancellor in January 1933, head of the government. Within a month, the Reichstag burned down. Hitler accused the communists and demanded emergency powers. He then used them to ban all other political parties. In August 1934, President Hindenburg died. Hitler declared himself president. He was now absolute leader, the Führer of Germany. At first, there was little sign of what was to come. For the next 3 years, the Führer concentrated on rebuilding Germany's economy. He spent millions on public works, including the 5,000-mile Autobahn system, to soak up the unemployed. But in secret, Hitler was also spending lavishly on a huge rearmament program. Under the Versailles Treaty, the German army had been limited to 100,000 men. The country was forbidden to have an air force, tanks, or submarines. This small army was trebled in size. Then, in 1935, Hitler came out into the open. He unveiled a brand new air force, the Luftwaffe. It had 2,500 planes, far more than Britain or France. Unemployment plunged, and the Nazis became enormously popular. Now emboldened, the Führer made his first expansionist move. In 1935, he reoccupied the Saarland district on the French border, after it voted to return from League of Nations to German rule. A year later, he sent German troops into the Rhineland, part of Germany which had been demilitarized at Versailles. At the time, many felt that Hitler was only claiming back what was rightfully Germany's. Neither Britain nor France objected. When Berlin hosted the 1936 Olympic Games, the Nazis were seen by many as firm but fair. A government which was restoring the nation's pride and which didn't threaten anyone. Of course, there were signs. The 1935 Nuremberg laws forbade Jews to marry true Aryan Germans and deprived them of their citizenship. But when the first threats came to world peace, they didn't come from Hitler at all, but from somewhere else entirely. Japan, at the start of the 20th century, was already a military power. It had defeated Russia in a war in 1905, and it had fought alongside the Allies in World War I. After the war, Japan was an acknowledged world power, and it signed up to the League of Nations. But politically, it was a mess of contradictions. Nominally a democracy, the feudal tradition was still strong. Most Japanese revered their emperor as a living god and regarded him as their true leader. And the country faced major economic problems. Its population was exploding. And it had no natural resources to fuel its rapidly expanding industries. Its leaders needed solutions, and they saw them in Chinese Manchuria. Manchuria was a land of rich grain fields, with plenty of coal and minerals. It was a perfect target. Japanese troops were already stationed there. Other possible targets were the colonies ruled by the European powers: Burma, Malaya, and Hong Kong, controlled by Britain; Indochina, ruled by France; and the Dutch East Indies. But at this stage, Japan had to be cautious. They didn't want to rouse the other great power in the Pacific, the United States. For all its anti-imperialist slogans, the US actually ran an unofficial empire in the Pacific. The Philippines, Guam, and several islands were under its direct rule. It undoubtedly had the strength to take on Japan, but since the end of World War I, it had had other distractions. This was America's Jazz Age. Throughout the 1920s, the nation concentrated on exploiting its vast resources. There was an economic boom that seemed without end. Fortunes were made both in industry and the stock markets. America seemed lost to the increasing pursuit of pleasure. With distractions like these, Japan's growing pains in the Pacific seemed very far away. America had slashed its army after World War I and agreed a naval reduction treaty with Britain, France, and Japan. This, in effect, handed naval superiority in the Pacific to the Japanese. And then came the Great Depression. As the economic devastation spread, a quarter of the population lost their jobs. Tens of thousands were made homeless, living in shantytowns. Whereas before it had been distracted by pleasure, now America was distracted by pain. It was time for Japan to make her move. In 1931, without even informing their own elected government, the Japanese forces in Manchuria seized the capital Mukden and then overran the rest of the territory. A puppet state, Manchukuo, was proclaimed under a puppet ruler. Henry Puyi, the last emperor of China, who had been deposed in 1911, was dragged out of retirement. At its headquarters in Geneva, the League of Nations now faced its first great test. Japan was universally condemned. But her response was blunt.
Japan, however, finds it impossible to accept the report adopted by the Assembly.
The Japanese then just walked out, and the League suddenly realized there was nothing it could do about Manchuria. Japan was declared an international pariah, but it didn't care. Its leaders had turned their eyes to further conquests in China. These were easy pickings. China was in a state of chaos. The government of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek was locked in conflict with the Chinese Communist Party under Mao Zedong. There was civil war. In 1936, as a precursor to invasion, the Japanese signed a pact with Hitler. The aim was to guard against any attack by Soviet Russia were it to move on China. Then in July 1937, the Japanese provoked an incident with Chinese troops and invaded. At first, the Chinese were taken by surprise. But they soon fought back fiercely, the Communists even joining the Kuomintang in a united front. The Japanese responded with amphibious landings. By the end of 1937, they had overrun much of northern China and the coast. The Japanese fought this war with exceptional brutality, bombing cities indiscriminately. Westerners living in the commercial center, the port of Shanghai, were now evacuated. The city was then besieged for 3 months. It suffered widespread damage, the Japanese forces showing no pity or concern for the native population. But it was after the capture of Nanking, then the Chinese capital, on December the 17th, 1937, that the Japanese forces really ran amok. Over 300,000 civilians are estimated to have been massacred during a 6-week orgy of rape and indiscriminate killing. The Japanese even attacked British and US warships which had been sent to protect their shipping and trade. The worst incident came on December the 12th, 1937. The American gunboat Panay was sunk by Japanese bombers. 50 crewmen died. Despite this, the Western powers refused to intervene. So the League of Nations could do nothing. In the United States, President Roosevelt wanted to impose a naval blockade of Japan.
It has become clear that acts and policies of nations in other parts of the world have far-reaching effects on us.
But the British would have none of it, fearing that it might provoke a war. So all Roosevelt could offer was a $25 million loan to Chiang Kai-shek to buy arms. Even though the communists were now fighting alongside the Kuomintang, the Soviet Union did little to help either. Its only involvement was a series of clashes along its own border with Manchuria. But China itself received nothing. Instead, it had to fight on alone. During 1938, the Japanese overran Canton and pushed the Chinese forces deeper into the west of the country. All the rhetoric of the League of Nations, all those promises to stop international aggression had come to nothing. And by now the Western powers were facing aggression much closer to home.
Deve cristallizzare una posizione di potente ingiustizia.
southern England, the long, hot summer of 1940. Young pilots take off to fight a deadly duel. It is the Battle of Britain, and never had the nation depended so much on so few brave men to preserve its freedom. But these young pilots were not alone. They were backed by an extraordinary new secret weapon, one which many experts consider the most vital of the war.
Most of us who participated like to say that the atomic bomb ended the war, but radar won it.
Radar's backroom heroes gave the Royal Air Force the edge over the Luftwaffe and helped save the nation from Nazi invasion. A new and deadly era of warfare began in May 1915, when a German Zeppelin airship dropped 120 bombs on London, killing or injuring 42 people. Zeppelin raids terrorized its citizens for 2 more years. Then, in June 1917, Britain's capital suffered its first attack by aircraft. 14 German Gotha bombers, each carrying 1 ton of explosive. Almost 5,000 civilians were killed or wounded in these early air raids. The need for an early warning system became obvious. Based on this wartime development of strategic bombing, aviation theorists were convinced that countries could be bombed into submission. It seemed as though the bomber would always get through and wreak devastation. Existing fighter biplanes were just too slow to catch them. If some way could be found of detecting hostile aircraft at a distance, then fighters would have enough time to take off and shoot them down. Sound detectors were developed, but with limited success. A new method of detection was needed, and during the 1920s, it was discovered that shortwave radio signals could be reflected from solid objects, such as ships. In December 1931, British Post Office radio engineers testing a shortwave radio telephone reported picking up fluttering signals whenever an aircraft passed by. Just over a year later, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. He immediately announced that Germany rejected the limitations on its armed forces and weapons production imposed at the end of World War I. It meant a dramatic build-up in German military strength. Suddenly, the prospect of another war ceased to be a distant possibility. In Britain, a committee was set up by the Air Ministry to look for new defence systems. Henry Wimperis was the Air Ministry's Director of Scientific Research. He heard about work being carried out at the National Physical Laboratory in Teddington, Middlesex, by Robert Watson Watt, a radio scientist. Born in Scotland in 1892, Watson Watt had a passion for invention. He could trace his family roots back to James Watt, the inventor of the steam engine. But at the Air Ministry meeting in January 1935, Watson Watt was disappointed to hear that Wimperis was only interested in exploring the possibility of a death ray using radiation. It sounded like science fiction, but Watson Watt agreed to investigate. He soon concluded that a death ray wouldn't work, but wondered if Wimperis was interested in radio detection rather than radio destruction. Wimperis was intrigued by Watson Watt's proposal. His immediate superior, Air Vice Marshal Hugh Dowding, future head of RAF Fighter Command, demanded a practical demonstration before he gave the go-ahead. At short notice, Watson Watt had to improvise an array of equipment. For a transmitter, he used the BBC's shortwave radio station at Daventry. A biscuit-coloured Morris truck was used to house a receiver in a nearby field. At 9:45 a.m. on February the 25th, 1935, a Hayford bomber took off and flew over the Daventry radio masts. Huddled around the receiver, the observers saw no signal at first. But on a second pass, they saw beats of very good amplitude on the display screen. Despite the haste of its organization, the experiment was a startling success. Radar had arrived, and not a moment too soon, as one of Watson Watt's colleagues, Edward Fennessy, made clear.
At that very same day, Hitler was officially announcing, in secret at that time, the formation of the Luftwaffe. So there was this great Nazi gathering in Berlin with Goering and all the top brass of the Luftwaffe, and there was this field with a van from Slough with Watson Watt inside it and his nephew parked on the grass bank outside. Quite a contrast in situations, and it was that experiment that was to play such havoc with Hitler's ambitions to conquer Europe and the world.
But for Watson Watt's assistant Arnold Wilkins, there were no immediate celebrations.
Watson Watt and the observer from the Air Ministry just got into their car and drove back to London, leaving me to clean up the apparatus and so on. And that was about all.
From the start, Watson Watt was confident that the detection range of his new invention could swiftly be improved.
I can now report that my guarantee of 60 miles has been fulfilled, and that my recent hope for 200-mile range on the high flyer is justified.
The Air Ministry was convinced and swiftly set up a research station on Britain's east coast to work on radio direction finding. In 1937, its work became even more urgent. German bomber crews went into action. During the Spanish Civil War, the Basque town of Guernica was selected for an horrific German experiment. Luftwaffe bombers flew over the town and dropped explosives and incendiaries on its civilian population. No military target was struck. It was purely intended as a terror tactic. More than 300 civilians were killed. It was a chilling foretaste of what bombers could do. Fortunately, as one of the scientific team, Sir Robert Coburn, described not long after the war, the Royal Air Force was refreshingly ready to listen to the boffins.
But the interesting thing was that, being lively-minded young men, they began to ask questions. Why do you do it this way? And soon they became involved in tactics, and operational research groups were set up. And on the part of the Air Force, they were a young service, so they were only too ready to take advice. And it seemed to just blossom that way.
From 1937 to 1939, radar developed into the core of the world's first integrated air defense system. Known as Chain Home, this consisted of 21 300-foot-tall radio masts sited along the coast of Britain. Radio signals sent out from these masts bounced back from objects in the sky and would be picked up by receivers at radar stations. The information appeared as blips on a cathode ray tube. These blips were then interpreted to give the distance, direction, height, and numbers of the approaching objects. A system was worked out for this data to be phoned through to RAF Fighter Command headquarters at Bentley Priory in Stanmore, just outside London. There it would be assessed, and information of an approaching raid then passed to Fighter Command's operations room. Controllers would alert the nearest RAF airfields, while Women's Auxiliary Air Force members plotted the approaching enemy on a map table. The RAF was now flying a new breed of fast monoplane fighters. It was these Spitfires and Hurricanes which would be guided into the attack by radar. This was high-tech warfare, and a long way from Watson Watt's Morris truck in a field. The revolutionary radar network should provide a wealth of information on approaching aircraft, but in the chaos of war, would it still work? So much trust was being placed in an untried method of defense. And in the summer of 1940, it faced its first crucial test, when Hitler sent in his bombers to crush Britain. Spring, 1940. Adolf Hitler overwhelmed most of Western Europe with his blitzkrieg warfare. Scandinavia, the Low Countries, France, all fell. German bombers played a key role in the campaign. Then, in summer 1940, he turned on Britain. But first he had to destroy British air power. Over 2,000 German bombers and fighters attacked RAF airfields in early August 1940. German pilots sang on their way to drop bombs on England. They were confident of victory. Nothing could stop them. For a moment it seemed they were right. At first the British air defences appeared overwhelmed by superior numbers. British aircraft were bombed and shot up on the ground. Airfields were wrecked. It looked as though the RAF was on the verge of defeat. Fighter Command was outnumbered almost 4-1. But if it could get advanced warning of German raids, the smaller number of British aircraft could concentrate against them. This was where Watts radar began to give Britain's air defences the edge. The intricate and integrated system of radar, observers, anti-aircraft guns, and precisely directed fighters began to work. Enemy bomber formations were picked up, and their positions passed on to Fighter Command's operations room. With accurate, up-to-the-minute information, RAF pilots were directed to the precise places where they were needed. They intercepted the German bombers and shot down increasing numbers. Vera Shaw, a control room operator during the battle, remembered her work.
The plots would come through from Stanmore, and we'd have to just hurriedly get them on the table. And then you called out for your block that had to represent the raid. In that block you usually got the number of raids and the height. The controller sat up there, and he was in charge of the whole of this area. And he had to read the raids on the table, and according to their position, he would call up the necessary squadron.
For Luftwaffe aircrew like Werner Schörer, it was an ugly shock.
I remember that I was very astonished at the time to find that as we crossed the Channel, there were always enemy fighters waiting for us in our sector. We had no idea that anything resembling radar even existed.
Most German raids in August were aimed at RAF airfields, but a few struck at other aspects of Britain's air defence. Five German raids were directed at radar stations in southern England on August the 12th. Some 85 crucial personnel were killed. Edward Fennessy was surprised they did not return to finish off the job.
We were waiting for them to come back the next day to extend the attack further up the East Coast, and we were completely mystified as to why they had not come back. And if they had done so, the whole of the South Coast radar system would have been out of action for weeks.
With the RAF blinded, Hitler would probably have won the Battle of Britain. But the Germans had not realized how vital radar was to British air defense. Then, on August the 24th, 1940, they made another decisive error. A flight of German bombers lost its way in the dark over England and accidentally dropped its bombs on the city of London. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill immediately ordered 81 bombers to attack Berlin the next night. As London burned, 4 more revenge bombing raids were sent over Germany's capital. The war against civilians on both sides was unleashed. In retaliation, Hitler vowed to raze Britain's cities to the ground. On September the 7th, he ordered 318 Luftwaffe bombers to pound London. Even with radar, Britain's air defences could not halt this savage blow. In the destruction that followed, most of it falling on London's East End, some 2,000 civilians were either killed or wounded. The next day, Londoners woke to the sight of thousands of homes and historic buildings reduced to rubble. The Blitz had begun, and suddenly everyone was in the front line. London's sacrifice meant a permanent and vital shift in German bombing strategy away from RAF airfields and radar stations. Britain's air defence was given the breathing space to rebuild itself. The raids on Britain's radar stations were never repeated. The Luftwaffe's failure to appreciate the importance of radar was its most costly error. The system remained intact and now readied itself to strike back at the terror bombers. On September the 15th, RAF fighters shot down a total of 56 German aircraft for the loss of some 26 British planes. The Luftwaffe could not carry on sustaining such losses. Some of its finest pilots were dead. Daytime raids over England were halted. As for Hitler, he had already abandoned his invasion of England. The RAF had paid a high price for victory in the air, but with the help of radar, it had won the Battle of Britain. Bombing raids continued over Britain into the next year, but they were conducted at night, as German aircrew were now wary of radar-directed British fighters. This meant that the RAF faced a new problem. The controllers could use radar to get the fighters close to German raiders, but they still had to pick them up by eye for the final attack. It took another year for an interception radar small enough to fit into night fighters to be developed. Then at last the German bombing blitz could be curbed. Watt's invention had passed its first test, but radar was to save his country a second time. From the first day of the war, Britain faced another equally desperate battle for survival in the Atlantic. Here, convoys of merchant ships carrying much-needed supplies were being decimated by packs of German submarines. If Britain did not win this battle, then it would starve to death. At this stage in the war, the Royal Navy had no way of detecting submarines on the surface other than by sight. Watt's early radar could not be used because of interference close to the surface of the sea. Knowing this, most U-boat attacks were made at night, and a desperate race began to defeat this menace. Over 4 million tons of Allied merchant shipping, some 677 ships, were sunk in the first year of the war. The U-boat crews called it their happy time. U-boat commanders such as Günther Prien became household heroes in Nazi Germany. It was up to Britain's backroom boffins to defeat these knights of the deep. The breakthrough came in 1940, when John Randall and Henry Boot of Birmingham University developed the cavity magnetron. This allowed the development of centimetric radar, using a much shorter wavelength which suffered less interference. In 1941, this was installed on British warships, accompanying Allied convoys. Now U-boats could be detected when on the surface. Sir Robert Atkinson was monitoring the effect of this new equipment.
The fact that you could now locate a U-boat on the surface at night or in day, especially at night, gave you a totally new weapon and a totally new dimension. For example, you might locate him 4 or 5 miles away. Later you could do better than that. But you knew where he was, and if you went straight for him, suddenly out of the darkness was coming an escort vessel to attack him, and he didn't quite know how this could be happening.
First blood for this new system went to HMS Vannock in March 1941, when it used radar to sink U-100. Depth charges rained down on the submarine, shattering its hull. Later versions of radar could spot targets as small as a raised periscope, while surfacing U-boats were detected at a distance of over 5 miles. When this radar system was fitted to aircraft, the days of the U-boat were numbered. At first, U-boats could pick up this use of radar and dive to avoid attacks. But from 1943 onwards, new versions of radar were undetectable. Warships and bombers could now act together to destroy the submarine wolf packs. Radar scientist Sir Bernard Lovell recalled the defeat of the U-boats.
It was absolute murder of U-boats in the North Atlantic, and Hitler, in a radio broadcast, complained that to quote his words, the temporary setback to our U-boat campaign is due to one single technical invention of our enemies. And then that single technical invention was the cavitation magnetron and its use in the centimeter radar.
Victory in the Battle of the Atlantic demonstrated how Watson Watt's idea of radar had been taken forward by other scientists. It developed into many forms for use on land, air and sea, and proved a supremely flexible invention. By the end of the war, radar had become part of a devastating array of weapon systems that brought Germany and Japan to their knees. It was the war-winning weapon above all others. In 1942, Watson Watt had been made Vice Controller of Communications Equipment. But at the end of war, in 1945, embittered at the lack of recognition received by him or his team, he resigned and went to Canada. He returned to Scotland shortly before his death in 1973. Today, his great invention still plays a vital role. It is at the core of most modern defense systems, but also has peaceful uses such as guiding airliners and safeguarding shipping all around the world. It is a remarkable legacy, and Britain can thank Watson Watt for an invention that saved it in its darkest hour.